Hello, everyone. Donna, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
My name is James Donnelly, founder and CEO of the CASA Group, and welcome back to episode 12 of our association leadership series. And I want to introduce again, although needs no more introduction, Donna Berger from the Becker Law Firm. Donna, welcome again.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here.
And Donna, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of our first webinar, really a result of COVID. I'm always looking for silver linings. And one of them was we got to do all of these webinars and share information with so many board members. So it's been.
And we still like each other.
Yeah, well, I was just going to go into that, Donna. It's Mariness is that beautiful voice you hear in the background introducing us. And it was Mariness's birthday yesterday. And it reminded me, Donna, we haven't really done a kind of public thank you to Mariness and Hope and Kara and Rose and Pete on IT in the background. And to that point, you may wonder why we need that many people, but Donna is very high maintenance. So that's
you have a fantastic team. Thanks to the team.
We really do.
Sure.
And we're so grateful for everyone to join us today. We're going to have some fun. It's we've been doing so much about COVID and some very specific topics. And all through the year, you've been texting in or chatting in your questions that were not really part of the topic, and we tried to stay on point. And so we decided today to have some fun and just go open forum. But Don, I do want to kind of get some quick updates from you before we jump into the Q&A. Starting with the COVID situation, the numbers are certainly, actually, I didn't do my qualification, Donna, about legal advice here. And I always try and do that. So Donna has been so generous with her brilliance. And I just want to remind everybody that unless you're a client of Donna's, she's not giving legal advice. She's just sharing thoughts that you can take to your own legal advice. And if there's any questions that come up about this or any other matter, just send them into info@casagroup.com, or if there's a document or something that we talk about today that you want to get something from. But Donna, I think we should just start with, where are we at with this COVID situation? The numbers are coming down. For our Florida listeners, there's a little bit of craziness in Miami, but other than that, things seem to be trending in a good direction. Thoughts?
Well, they are, and I actually made some notes. So the Florida's positivity rate is right now hovering around 6%. Maybe even it bumps up a little above 6%, but we're not below 6%. Now, most of the experts say to be able to treat the pandemic as under control, quotes unquote, it needs to be at or below 5%. So right now, Florida's trending at about 6%, a little higher than 6%. So I don't know that we can say, according to the experts, that we are completely under control. Made a note, 12.63% of Florida's population has completed the series of doses required to be vaccinated. Eligibility, as you know, has dropped to age 50 now, 50 and up, and as well for frontline workers, people with medical conditions. As of Monday, 2,871 people are hospitalized in Florida, throughout Florida, and that breaks down in the Tri-County area. Broward has 460 hospitalized, Palm Beach has 194, Miami has 558. Now, the overall state of emergency, James, is in effect until April 26th. We'll see if the governor extends it further, but it's important to note that there are local states of emergency that are still in effect. For example, Broward County, their state of emergency is in effect until March 30th. Palm Beach is through March 25th, and Miami-Dade through March 25th. I'm sorry, Palm Beach is March 26th. So it's all end of March, but we have local counties that are still under states of emergency as well.
Yeah, and I think that's important for all the counties. You highlighted the big three in our state, but I think the point here is, even though really the governor's relaxed almost all restrictions, that there's still local restrictions that apply. And yet, I also wanted to mention the same really holds true in Texas. Governor Abbott's basically opened it up, and the vaccination rates in both states are around close to 25% having at least one dose. We're close to 25 in Florida and a little less than that in Texas. I got my first one last week, Donna. I think you did recently as well. So I'm waiting for number 2 get back out there in society. The other thing I wanted to mention for everybody, the American Rescue Plan Act, which is the 1.9 trillion, there were a couple of things in there that I think are going to impact all associations. And one of them is the unemployment benefit in that rescue package added to the Florida regular unemployment is paying people to not work $16.88 an hour. And I know we found it. I know my competitors have found it, and I suspect the associations on this have found it. We are literally having potential teammates say to our recruiting team that they'll see us in September. They can stay home and play video games all summer and make $17 an hour. I think this was an unintended consequence, but it's a reality that we're facing, especially in those $15 to $20 an hour positions. And the other one,
there's certainly a risk if they take that stance that the job will be there waiting when they decide to come back. So
honestly, the good news is anyone that does want to stay home, maybe you don't want to have them on your team anyways. But the other one that I think will be maybe surprising to some of our listeners, especially our board members, is that we get charged, all businesses, all employers get charged an unemployment insurance premium administered by the state. And because of COVID, and it renews annually, the cost of unemployment insurance in Florida has gone up by a factor of over 5. So that's going to flow through to all of our budgets. And I'm happy to that's a deep dive. I'll take questions offline for that one. But 2 things to look for from the business perspective of our associations. Okay, I want to jump into our questions, Donna. And I have heard from our listeners that they love the polling questions. And so let's go poll question 1, Mariness. It's one we're asking every week, every month, just to make sure everyone's sharing with each other what they're doing with their COVID policies. And Donna,
James, you care to hazard a guess? Do you think that most people are pretty much status quo in terms of the policies?
I do. I think that there will be some decreasing. The few that will be increasing. Actually, let's share the results, Mariness. Yeah, there you go. So most people, no change. So the decrease has started though, Donna. That number is bigger than we've seen yet, which I don't think is surprising. And we already have some questions on the board of what should we do. So we'll talk about that. And I believe those small number of increased restrictions, there's been some positivity in their community, and that was just a prudent action on that. And then we're going to talk about vaccines. So Mariness, let's put. Did we share? Yeah, we shared that. Let's put up the vaccine question number 2 right now. I think everyone would be interested to see whether our numbers reflect the state, whether you have had a vaccination or not yet. Or won't be getting it. Yeah, we got some.
James, you mentioned 25%. I mentioned 12.63%. My percentage is people who've received both doses. Correct. Or sufficient doses. Yours reflected first dose.
Well, combined, either 1 or 2. Yeah, 24% of Florida have received at least 1. And if you add to that, 10% of our population has got COVID. It's about 35% of Florida. I don't know the exact numbers for Texas. Wow. Are we ready to share the vaccine information? This is great. Please share, Mariness. I think this may result from our audience being, is that shared? Yeah, there you go. So way to go, everybody. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. We could all have a party, this group, because we can get together. But okay, well, I thought you'd be interested in that. Okay, Donna, let's jump in here. Can you scroll up to the top of the questions? The first one is really about policy. What policies can we change? When can we change them? I'll ask it the specific question, but I think, Donna, what everyone really wants to know is more broadly, what should we be doing as a board? The first one is, can we open pools without monitors and special cleaning 55 plus Palm Beach County? So Dave is asking that question. So I think maybe just to expand the question a little bit, what is it time, or what criteria should we be looking for to open up our amenities, Donna?
So I'll answer Dave personally. First, he's in Palm Beach County. So Palm Beach County's state of emergency and their executive order is still in effect. So my first recommendation to Dave, if he's on the board, it would be get with your attorney, make sure you go through the existing local Palm Beach order to make sure you're operating your pool in compliance. I see nothing in there that wouldn't allow them to reopen the pool. The requirements regarding the cleaning are no longer in place, but social distancing is in place in Palm Beach County, and facial coverings in all common areas is still in place. Now, they do have an exception in Palm Beach County with regard to facial coverings for religious reasons, medical reasons, and you don't need to wear it while you're exercising as long as you're social distance. But I think the bigger issue, as you addressed, James, is it time to just turn the light switch back on? And the answer is no, not yet. And we're going to talk about legislation later and why it's important that you are still operating in compliance with all local orders. Now, the state order, the state has basically opened up, and that's because the state wants to stimulate the economy. There are still local orders that have to be complied with. So you need to know what's in that local order, and are you meeting that? You do not want to be operating below the floor of the local order. But I do have some clients that they do have the pool open, they are maintaining it. Well, even if there's not a requirement, James, that you clean it, it's still a good idea to be enforcing social distancing, facial coverings. A lot of my clients are still requiring cleaning. Some still have owners taking their own furniture down just because we're under a statewide state of emergency until April 26th. And they don't see the need to take that risk, even though surface transmission is now causing less concern than a year ago when we talked about this.
But the specific question of do you need a monitor, there's no requirement to have a monitor.
No, but as I said, many of my communities are still finding that they need a monitor to enforce the social distancing and the facial covering. Now think about that. Palm Beach still requires facial covering, still requires social distancing. So if you don't have a monitor present and something happens, how are you going to prove that you were actually operating in compliance with the local order? Without that monitor, I don't know that you're going to be able to do that. Some people will have security cameras by the pool. Unless it's showing every angle, again, you have to think about how am I going to be able to prove in the worst case scenario that we were operating in compliance with the code. And that might require a monitor. That might be the best way, even though the order's not saying you need a monitor there, that may be the best way for you to prove that you were enforcing the other aspects of the order.
Well, I'll tell you from a practical level, Donna, our communities that are larger that have pool attendants and whatnot, obviously they kind of have the infrastructure in place to monitor and can, but our smaller communities are not paying extra money or having board members monitor like they did at the peak of the pandemic. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to weave our legislative chat in here. There's a couple of really interesting bills that are relevant here on liability and some decision making for the board, but I think I'm going to leave it a bit because I want to keep getting the questions going. And some of these are related. What is your opinion about requiring a mix of vaccinated person with non-vaccinated persons in opening up an area? So I guess this is from Daniel. I think that the real question is, okay, can we require vaccinations to get into an amenity? And are we creating liability if we have vaccinated and non-vaccinated coming into an amenity? Is that an answerable question there, Donna?
It is answerable, and it's something that's actually just come up at Becker. We have an internal listserv with our 38 board certified attorneys, and it just recently came up in 2 different communities in 2 different locations in Florida saying, hey, we want to open the clubhouse, but we only want to allow vaccinated people to enter the clubhouse. Does that create issues? Quick and short answer, yes, it creates issues, and it may not actually accomplish your goal. So if you've got, and I know, James, I know Castle has a lot of these mega clubhouses, very large spaces. even before vaccinations were available, it may have been possible to open up certain areas in those clubhouses, not a small card room, but certainly a larger space where you could limit it to, limit the social gathering and really space out your people. I think relying on vaccinations is a really slippery slope. First of all, we've only got, less than 15% of the population that has 2 doses right now, and we don't know the efficacy, particularly with these variants floating around. So I think it can create that false sense of security. And again, remember we talked about this when it came to notification. Remember way back when we were talking about we've got a positive case, should we notify which building, which floor, which unit? The reason we said no is because it creates this false sense of security. Oh, I live in a different building, I'm safe. To open up a clubhouse or another amenity and say you have to be vaccinated to get in, people may think, well, if they're letting me in and I'm vaccinated, that means I am 100% safe doing this. We know that any vaccine does not have 100% efficacy. You get the flu shot, it doesn't mean you're never going to get the flu. And what we're hearing with most of these vaccines is that they will prevent death, hopefully prevent death and serious illness, but not prevent you from getting the virus or transmitting the virus. Again, I am recommending to my clients that this is a slippery slope. I know people want to be able to open up and do it as quickly as possible, but you're also going to open yourself up to people claiming you're discriminating against me. I can't take the vaccine for religious purposes or for health purposes. How dare you? Do you want that as a board to have to deal with that as well?
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I think that the trouble with that for our boards is, well, when do we? And I think what is like, if you look at I think Florida and Texas at 5,000 cases a day, 5,000 cases a day last spring was terrible. It feels okay now because we were at 17,000. But I think what we may have to be looking to is not just vaccinations, but that our society numbers are down before. But this is going to be a really difficult decision. And I think, Donna, one of the things you told me offline is we need to look for some authority or support for this decision. And that could be the local rules, that could be consultation with your attorney, that could be the numbers coming down. So I know our listeners would love a black and white answer, but I just don't think.
Well, let me just say one other thing, because I know this is on a lot of people's minds. If you look at the statutory emergency powers, James, it does say that if we want to shut off portions of the premises as being uninhabitable, we need to look to emergency management officials or a licensed professional hired by the board. So this language was actually created to deal with the aftermath of a hurricane. And the board would go out and hire an engineer, and the engineer would come out and say, you can't go in the building, it's not safe, it's been structurally impacted. Conceivably, a board could hire a licensed medical professional to say, okay, you know what, it's safe for you to open the clubhouse or the gym to vaccinated people. That's a discussion that board needs to have with legal counsel as to whether or not hiring a medical professional will allow them to open certain amenities or operate certain amenities in the way they see fit. But again, as you just mentioned, you have to be able to trace a source of authority for what you're doing. Is it because the Department of Health has said this is okay? Is it because your county order says it's okay? Is it because the CDC says it's okay for you to do this? You have to be able to trace the source of authority somewhere, or is it because your attorney has written a legal opinion saying it's okay to do this? Anything's better than just saying we were fatigued and we wanted to get back to normal.
Yeah, I really think a biggie is going to be, if I think of cruise ships or airlines, or crossing borders, I go up to Canada when I can, or used to do, and can they stop you and require vaccines? So there's going to be some legal precedent, I think, about can we use vaccines as an entry ticket into a whole bunch of things, including amenities. But I would not establish that policy without legal counsel. Okay, I want to put up a question number 3 because it's directly relevant to this conversation. And this is really goes to the question we've been discussing, Donna, is are you considering mandatory vaccine policies? Boy, we anticipated this one.
There are some adverse effects to mandatory vaccination, not to discourage anyone, because vaccination is going to be super important for everyone, but there are some people who get adverse effects. So if you're mandating the vaccine and somebody says, but for my association requiring it, I may not have gotten it, or I may not have gotten it at this point, again, you open yourself up to another issue. I think encouraging vaccination is the way to go, but mandating it is a slippery slope.
Okay, let's share the results of that. I think this will support your comments, Donna. Most people are not considering mandatory. But I want to pop up question 4 right away because it's exactly relevant to what we were just talking about. Will you open up your amenities once vaccines are widely available? Yeah, let's get that answer too. I also want to, there's some questions coming in here that are not COVID, and we're obviously going to get to those, but there's one more grouping here that I think should go together. What about our employees? And one question is Castle requiring mandatory vaccination of its team? The answer is no. On legal advice, you can require it, but there are so many accommodations, it's almost more difficult than trying to require it. But I think a better question for our clients and for even if you're a self-managed community out there or managed by one of my competitors, can you insist on your employees being vaccinated? And well, first of all, let's share the results of this. Will you open up your amenities once vaccines are widely available? Leaning yes, leaning no. Yeah, when I formed this question, I knew it wasn't going to be cut and dry. So I just wondered if I said yes or no, people would hit I don't know. But this is instructive in that I think people really want to open them, Donna.
Well, James, at some point, when SARS was the issue years ago, at some point, the World Health Organization declared the pandemic over. At some point, there will be a declaration that this pandemic is over. I hope. It's always been the case in the past that these things have an end point, okay? So that vaccinations are certainly one factor, but they're not the only factor here. Because as variants continue, as the pandemic, wages on, again, being vaccinated, even widely vaccinated, is great. But you don't know, and I know some communities are actually talking about requiring to see those little vaccination cards you get when you come in, so people can't lie and say I was vaccinated and they really weren't. I think you have to look, you can't look at this in a vacuum when it comes to vaccinations. To your point about employees, I do have some clients that are now writing into their contracts with vendors, let's say the landscaping crew, or if they're going to be having construction, that they want to know that it's a vaccinated crew that's entering the community. That's something to speak to legal counsel about. I do put a COVID clause into my contracts now for that purpose. For some communities, it's very important. It's also important, where is the work taking place? Is it outside or is it inside the building?
Well, I just want to pick up something you said. You're adding COVID clauses to contracts. I just love for our audience to have some takeaways. You may want to think about that and talk to your own counsel about it. From a practical advice, I know, Donna, you're giving the legal advice. I just don't see the merits in mandatory employee vaccinations, especially in this labor environment. We've operated for the whole last year without that requirement, for the most part, very safely. And we're now just going under 5%. Unemployment rate again in Florida, and with the unemployment benefit of not working, it is tough for talent right now. And I think you wouldn't want to put any more restrictions on getting your team together. But I think we've
add to that real quick, because again, we're getting back to that false sense of security. The vaccinations don't mean you can't transmit. It just means you're not going to get sick or die. In some regards, I can see us talking months from now about how risky behavior with people who've been vaccinated may take more risks than people who are not vaccinated. So you could actually have a vaccinated workforce that might actually pose more of a threat of transmission than a non-vaccinated one that is still covering up, maintaining social distancing. So it's a lot to digest.
Yeah, and so just to do a little summary there, we've talked about requiring vaccinations to open up amenities. We've talked about just when do we open up amenities. We've talked about requiring vendors and employees for vaccination. I want to go just back up to the top of my list here because we promised to do open forum, Donna. These aren't COVID related, but Ellen was asking if you have set up automatic maintenance deductions with your management company, can they charge you each for each transaction. And the answer to that I don't think is legal as much as business. They certainly can if it's provided for. Donna, would you agree?
I would agree. Well, although with credit card charges, you're not supposed to add the credit card charges onto the assessment if you're allowing people to pay by credit. That the credit card processing fee should be absorbed by the association.
Okay. If a board access a fine against an owner and the owner does not appeal, do you still have to have a fining committee meeting to levy the fine? From Robert.
Yes. So Robert, it's not a question of appealing. The statute is pretty clear, and they've gone back and forth on this, but it's a bifurcated process. First, the board has a regular board meeting and decides to levy a fine or impose a suspension. And then the violator is notified with 14 days notice that there will be a grievance or fining committee hearing, and that violator has an opportunity to show up and convince the committee why the board's fine or suspension should not be ratified. That committee, that fining or grievance committee, is not an appellate court. It's just they have one function to say either we agree with the board's fine or suspension or we don't. If they don't agree, it's done. If they do agree, then the board can proceed with the suspension or the fine. I would say 90% of the time, the violators do not show up. You still have to have the meeting, maybe a 5-minute meeting where the manager or board member lays out what the issue was and why the fine or suspension was imposed, and then you move forward.
Okay, excellent. Okay, one of our listeners wants to know about Associa's investment in Castle last year, Don. I'm not sure.
I think that's for you.
Yeah. So yeah, we do have an equity partner at Castle now. The founders, so myself, my brother Rob, and Craig are still running the show. We still have a significant financial interest, and we're really excited. We are not going anywhere. Same team running it. But the specific question is, what is the effect for Castle condominium clients? And we're super excited. We now have some national resources we didn't have before. Specifically, basically, the company that bought us called PMG Holdings that took the equity stake. They own about 100 management companies across the country, Mexico, Canada. And their biggest brand is Associa. It's not one we'll operate under, but there are Associa companies in Florida, which we compete directly against. But they basically took the biggest expenses for communities: landscaping, roofing, painting, insurance, elevators, and they've gone and got buying groups nationally that, so for the first time ever, we're going to be able to bring some really neat economies, and excited to talk to our clients about that. Just because
I'm excited for you guys.
Yeah. So I hope that answered, Howard, your question. Happy to talk to you directly. Cynthia wants to know, is a mask required at the pool in Palm Beach?
Yes.
Yes.
It is when you go to, Cynthia, when you go to the pool, but when you're in the pool and you're exercising, you can take it off.
And what about Broward? Next question is from Pete. What about Broward?
Same thing. Now, Broward has a few more. Broward has, I wrote this down, 10-person limit on gatherings indoors, but there's an exclusion for day-to-day operations. That's subject to interpretation. So we've just been through meeting season. Does that mean that you could only have, you had to limit your in-person component to 10 people? I took the conservative approach and said, yeah, limit it, but that could come under the 10-person exclusion. Social distancing, yes. Facial coverings in Broward in the elevators, hallways, lobby, any indoor space, facial coverings, and even outdoors walking. If you can't maintain social distancing, you need facial coverings.
Pete wants to know, how would a resident be able to prove they contracted COVID while at the pool and hold the HOA liable? We've talked about that a couple of times.
Pete, we've talked about that. And here's the thing, and this is the scoop from PI attorneys I've talked to. They don't have to prove 100% causation. They just have to prove negligence on the part of the association, that the association was operating below the level of any local, county, state order, or even operating outside the recommendations of public health officials. So they do not have to prove it 100%. They just have to prove that the association was negligent and created an environment that was conducive to COVID transmission.
Next question from Lewis is whether management companies are willing to include incentives, rewards for employees to get vaccinated. I know we've chosen not to require vaccinations and therefore not to have any financial incentive, that was really done mostly on legal advice, and that it opens up, what about flu shots? What about virtually every drug out there? So that's why. But Donna, do you have any comments more generally about associations providing incentives to have the vaccine?
For the associations that have direct employees, James, I do encourage some sort of incentive, and that may be offering a PTO that you can, if you're going to, an extra PTO to go do it. We saw a lot of our associations do that during the election, that if they wanted to encourage voting, they would offer an extra PTO to go vote. I don't see it any differently here. I agree with you about mandating it as an employer. I think you open up a host of issues regarding ADA, that you've got objections religiously or medically, and now you've got other issues, paying legal bills and dealing with labor lawyers. We happen to have an in-house labor expert at Becker, and I ran this by her, and she agrees. Encouraging, certainly; mandating, much more difficult.
Excellent. Jillian is president of a condo, and she has a resident with multiple people living in a unit. How do we deal with that if they're not living there legally?
So the question is, are these extra people living there while the owner is also living there, or is the owner absent and these people are there? And is this a violation of your leasing restrictions and the owner is just claiming that they're guests? Or is this just a violation of your occupancy restriction or your local occupancy ordinance? You can check with the county and the city, have your attorney tell you what the ordinance says in terms of how many people are permitted per bedroom or per square footage. You first have to figure out, what are they violating? Are they violating a leasing restriction because the owner's not there and you suspect that they're leasing out and just calling these people guests, which happens all the time, by the way. This is probably, if you don't have a guest occupancy amendment in your documents, you should talk to council about doing that, where we treat people who are there for a certain number of days, James, with the owner absent. We just treat them as a de facto tenant. We don't care what you're going to call them. We're treating them as a tenant. They're going to be screened like a tenant, and you're going to follow the rules.
I'm thinking, Donna, we mentioned amending documents so much. I think we should do a whole session on that. And I think our next one's going to be probably a legislative update, because it'll be right at the end of the legislative session. Even Texas, who only meets every other year, I think I want to be a Texas legislator.
Every other year. Okay, good.
Yeah,
less damage.
It goes till May 31. Okay, Dave is asking, can we fine people for not voting for a document update? Not how they vote, just whether they do or don't.
Oh,
Dave, the answer to that, Dave.
Dave's a man after my own heart. Can we fine people for not voting? Dave, unfortunately, you can't. And listen, fines have limited usefulness, in my opinion. A fine in a condo or a co-op cannot become a lien. So you cannot lien somebody that's a very big hammer. In a homeowners association, you can lien for fines if the documents allow you to fine, if they exceed $1,000, and your documents allow you to fine in amounts over 100 per diem. So fines have limited usefulness, because you really would frankly have to pursue somebody in small claims court to collect the fine. But to Dave's point about apathy, here's what I tell people when you're looking to take a vote. If you've got delinquent people, make sure you follow the statutory procedure to suspend their voting rights. Sometimes we've had votes, and only to come to find out that 10 or 20 people should have been suspended because they were delinquent, and they weren't, and that impacted everything. When you properly suspend the voting rights of delinquent owners, it reduces your quorum requirement and it reduces the amendatory threshold. So make sure you're looking at that.
Donna, that reminds me of a question that was emailed in late today. The validity of votes of a director who hasn't met eligibility requirements. In other words, they haven't got their certification or whatnot. So I'm in a condo and we have a vote, and we subsequently learn that one of the directors is not eligible to vote. Is that vote good or it's not good?
It's good. It's still valid, and it's important to, and then this is true, James, whether the person was ineligible because they were delinquent or they were ineligible for another reason. They never should have been elected to the board. Let's say they were a convicted felon whose voting rights were not restored. That's still not going to impact the validity of the board vote that was taken at the time this person was on the board. What the board, now, if the entire board was ineligible, then you might have an issue. If everybody sitting on the board was delinquent or a convicted felon whose rights have not been restored, that's going to be a little more problematic. But assuming it's one person, it's not going to impact the validity of the vote. And it's important to remember that boards can always ratify a vote taken when something questionable like this happens. Maybe it was a deficient notice. Maybe they didn't post notice with sufficient time. Maybe they didn't have a quorum established when the meeting started. For any number of reasons, if there's a flaw, they can ratify that at a subsequent board meeting, which is duly noticed, which did have a quorum, which has only eligible people serving. So it's kind of like a do-over they get.
Yeah, I think that was when you and I talked about this offline, that was the most practical advice, in that don't worry about it, just ratify it at the next meeting. Okay, and audience, this is great. You're bringing some great questions. We're all over the map. This was our idea, just kind of open forum. I'm not going to mention name here just because it could be, it could disclose the property, but there's a president of a community that's not enforcing violations and appropriate penalties for, in this case, political signage. You know, what can someone do if the board or the president is not enforcing their own documents, Donna?
Oh, I hate to hear about that, particularly when it's the president. You know, you agreed to serve on this board. You're in a leadership position, lead. You know, one of the primary functions of a board of directors is to enforce consistently and uniformly the documents. That's why people buy in communities in the first place, because they understand that there's a set of restrictions, there's a framework within which they want to live to, in their mind, enhance the quality of their lifestyle and improve their real property values. If there's something like a no signage rule, you've got two options. One, if you don't have any intention of enforcing it, then amend it out. Take it out. If it's a rule, a board rule, reverse the rule. If it's provision of your documents, put it to the members if it's no longer serving your purposes. But if that's not the case here, and we're just dealing with a rogue director, remember, boards cannot remove directors from the board. They can remove officers. So if it is a president that's gone rogue, one of my first recommendations is take an organizational vote. Remove that person as president. They'll still be on the board. They'll still be a director, but you need your officers to be the leaders. You need everybody on the board to lead. And you know, we've talked about this before, James. More and more of my clients are requesting a board member code of conduct. Is it a cure-all? No. Is it a silver bullet? No. But at least with a code of conduct that you sign off on, everybody agrees, here's what the expectations are, and here's what, so you can't say, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. And we can dig into that at some point in a future webinar.
I just made a note of that one. Okay, if board finds a resident and the violation is corrected between that time and the hearing meeting, does the board have to rescind the fine at the next board meeting? That's from Gerald.
They don't have to, Gerald. They can keep the fine, or they can decide that, look, fines are not meant to be, you know, to exact a pound of flesh. They're meant to do what? Result in corrective behavior. Yeah. So, you know, do you need the $100? Probably not. If you know, my mom always had a saying, you can afford to be gracious. If you want to forego the fine because they have immediately corrected, you can do that. If you want to say, no, you were fined because of what you did, then go ahead.
Linda's got 3 questions. I don't know whether we're going to get them all in. That was, I don't know whether putting them all in one chat, Linda. Is the board required that we continue the 55 plus census to perform a census every 2 years? That
was actually removed in legislation last year. So no, although I do recommend, Linda, that you continue to keep a handle on your residency, because you're still required under federal law to prove that at least 80% of your units are occupied by somebody 55 and over. So take a look at your new purchase application and the documents you take at the time of purchase, just to be sure that if you're ever challenged, that you do have the supporting documentation for your housing for older persons status.
And then is the board required to report the outcome of elections by the number of votes received per candidate?
No, and I recommend, sometimes it's embarrassing for the person who there's just gets the lowest level of votes. Yeah, well, there's no reason for that. There's no requirement. Of course, all the voting materials are maintained as part of the official records. So if somebody wants to, if an owner wants to know who got the most votes. The tally sheets will all be there. They'll be able to look at it, but I don't recommend announcing that.
Well, Steve, who's on the board of my building, I won't say which building, Steve, I'm not telling anyone how many votes you got. Robert, how can Castle help condo associations establish and nurture a culture of daily awareness and uniform enforcement of rules and regulations? Donna, this is a great one. Robert, thank you. I think the first one is communication. I think that, first of all, there's significant turnover in buildings. And so you can't communicate once and then assume everyone knows. It's got to be constant. It's got to be positive. In fact, I think the first step in enforcement, Donna, is to communicate what the rules are. Often, in an HOA, we'll often do in the newsletter, we're going to be inspecting roofs in March, please get your roof done. Then we don't have to be doing as many enforcement because people got the positive message. And I think the second thing, Donna, is consistency.
Oh, you took the word right out of my mouth.
And then finally, using a couple of the questions above as an example, the board has to act like you cannot not follow the rules. You can't have, during COVID, 6 foot apart chairs and then the president or the director come along and move them all together. So I think communication, consistency, and leading by example would be my 3. Donna, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we need to touch very, very briefly on prior board practices. When you're talking about covenant enforcement, if you've had prior boards that have just ignored, failed to enforce, overlooked covenants, I don't care whether it's a parking restriction, a pet restriction, a leasing restriction, that doesn't mean that a subsequent board that gets into place is handcuffed and you're forever precluded from enforcing those covenants. Get with legal counsel. There's a procedure called republication. It's pursuant to a case known as chattel shipping in Florida. And basically that case stands for the premise that you can draw a new line in the sand if you republish the provisions in the documents that have been overlooked. So when I hear from a client that, oh my gosh, we've got all these exterior modifications that shouldn't have been approved. We've got no handle on the parking places. I said, let's go through the documents. You tell me which areas have not been enforced, as you said, consistently, uniformly, routinely, and we will republish that. Those require a 14-day notice of the board meeting, so it's not a 48-hour notice. You have to let people know that we are republishing these sections. You have to send it out, and then you've got a new starting point where we're going to once again start enforcing this. So a lot of times it's just that prior board practice has dug a hole for the current board to start effectively enforcing, but it can be overcome.
I think this is important, Donna. We have a lot of board members probably listening that are new board members and don't appreciate that there is kind of a restart protocol you can follow with legal advice. Okay, Elizabeth wants to know, we're requiring masks in our gym. Can we allow residents to remove their mask while on cardio equipment?
Yeah, Elizabeth, if you're in Palm Beach, it actually has that exception for exercising. I think it's a common sense thing, but make sure that your machines are spaced out enough where you're not going to have that issue. Many people take that. The other 2 counties have not addressed it the way Palm Beach County has. So I don't know what county Elizabeth is in, but speak with counsel, get an opinion from counsel on that as well. But I've told my clients, as long as they're maintaining the distancing between the machines, you've got issues requiring people to exercise while wearing a mask. I know some gyms are requiring that, some are not. It's really going to be a conversation with counsel and looking at your county order.
A couple of questions about really resident behavior here. Paulette wants to know if we have a resident that keeps attacking the board nonstop, offensive emails, stories, how do they deal with that? How does the board deal with the resident that's just ever present and ever attacking the board?
I teach a class, James, called Dealing with Difficult People. It's one of my most well-attended classes. Of course, there's all sorts of different difficult people, vendors, owners, board members, you name it. But in this case, she's asking about a difficult resident. First of all, is the resident a tenant or an owner? It's easier if it's a tenant because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. You're not going to renew the lease. If it's an owner, it becomes a lot more difficult. you really need to dig into what's creating it. Some of the first questions I'll ask when I hear about this, we've got a resident who's attacking vendors, attacking neighbors, attacking the board. I say, how long has this person lived there? If they tell me 15 years, has this person been a problem all 15 years? Or is this potentially something that's related to a cognitive issue, Alzheimer's or some other cognitive issue that's at play? If they tell me the person's been there 5 years, they've been a jerk from the very beginning, now I know I'm dealing with this problem. If they tell me, no, they were great, but the last 3 years, the person lost their spouse, it's gotten worse, now I know I'm dealing with a more sensitive cognitive issue. I tell you, the best way, James, to deal with these issues is to have policies and protocols in place before you need them. Difficult people tend to exploit the lack of protocols in association operations. I go to the meeting, I'm a difficult person, I'm going to filibuster for 30 minutes on the floor and use expletives. If you don't have a board rule on participation at meetings, that's an issue. By the way, if they use the meetings as the forum to attack people, if you get a sergeant at arms, once we go back to the in-person meetings, that can really help. Right now, Zoom meetings have helped a lot. In a lot of my communities that had that personality type of a resident, the mute button has been a blessing. The other weapon that difficult residents tend to use is repeated document inspection requests. Make sure you have that protocol in place. You have the framework, you can really cut down on it. And I will say, lastly, difficult people like to eat up your time. So what do? They send their daily or maybe even hourly email haranguing the manager about all the things that are wrong in the community. You have to have an email protocol in place. And maybe your manager or your board members don't respond to every email. There's ways to set up an email protocol, and I've done it for a lot of clients, where you don't need to be the whipping bag for a resident. And I have to tell you, I call some of them recreational complainers, because it really is a hobby, and they get that little dopamine hit every time you respond.
Yeah, I mean, we have these types of owners, and we have so many communities, it's bound to happen. But I agree with everything you said. And the only one, at some point, we've even had the attorney send a cease and desist, and the management will no longer respond. Please forward any of your questions or comments to the attorney directly. And the other thing is, you don't have to. We do reply to all owner and resident and guest and board emails and calls on normal course, because that's what we're paid for. But I do not believe there's a legal requirement, other than for a request for records, that you have to respond to every call or email. Is that true?
So let's just tell you this, request for records by email, I have a rule that says it has to be in the subject line. Otherwise, the board member or manager does not need to read a 22-paragraph email rant. If it's an email document inspection, you're right. But if it's a condo or co-op and they want to complain about something, it needs to be sent by certified mail. A lot of times, just a standard thank you, have a nice day, thanks for your input. You can't dance alone. They want to have that back and forth. And you're right, sometimes it gets so bad, we will have to proceed with a restraining order. Sometimes it's gotten so bad, we've actually had to move to get an injunction to remove the person from actually living there. But that's only in the most egregious of circumstances.
Interesting. Another kind of a related question, but you've got the 3-minute time to speak on agenda items. A lot of boards are quite loose about that, because they don't want to run a police state. But let's say we're a board and we're quite open and informal with questions, and then we get that owner. Can we then enforce that 3-minute to just get that situation under control?
You really need to have a rule and enforce it across the board. I understand, but you can't just be making, fly decisions. Okay, everybody else can talk for 20 minutes, but the person we don't like, or the person who really is a troublemaker, has got 3. These protocols and rules need to be applied uniformly. And by the way, James, sometimes when we've got somebody, we've had to install a rule, enforce it for a couple of months. When the person starts, these rules are not set in stone. You can modify them. So maybe if you're having a problem for a short period of time, maybe that you have to tighten up the rule and apply it to everyone. Maybe the person moves away. Now we can modify the rule and be a little more lax.
Okay, Donna, we have 8 minutes left and more than 8 minutes worth of questions.
Wait, we have 8 minutes left on this webinar?
Yeah, we may have to do another Q&A. I think our audience is loving this. Okay, let's try and rapidly go through these, Donna. Tammy wants to know, can you apply penalties such as a loss of use of amenities if they do not follow COVID guidelines in place by the board?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, Tammy. And by the way, I have taken the position, sometimes just suspending it for one person. I ask my clients this. No, nobody's wearing facial coverings. Nobody's observing social distancing. Are we talking about one or two or a handful of people? Or are we talking about 10% of the community? If it's 10% of the community, shut it down until they use, peer pressure on each other to start behaving. Then you can open it back up. Otherwise, you're chasing, after one or two, you're chasing after numerous violators. But that's a very big hammer to shut things down, but it's very effective.
I think it's one of the best tools in the tool belt.
Yep.
Okay, David wants to know, we're trying to change our docs so they don't count all owners, which means anyone not voting is counted as a no vote. It didn't pass. Could you please talk about how it's going with condos trying to change these clauses?
Well, I would just say that I'm not quite sure what David is. It David? I'm not quite sure what he's asking, but I will tell you this. You can't say that if you don't vote, if you don't vote, it is a no vote. It's not a yes vote. You can't say, there are ways to structure this. For instance, when I look at a mandatory threshold on a document, I look and say, how can we make this easier? Sometimes a majority of a quorum or 2/3 of a quorum, that's a lower but high achievable goal. So first you get the quorum, and then you decide what percentage of a quorum you want to allow. That's different than saying 2/3 of the total membership. That 2/3 of the total membership is a very high threshold. 2/3 of a quorum, assuming your quorum is a majority of your owners, much lower threshold. So speak with counsel, but there are ways to do this. But you can't say, we're only going to count the people who vote unless you structure it that way, which you can say this percentage of people present and voting at a meeting by person or proxy at which a quorum has been established. I've done that many times.
Yeah, you also want to be careful. You don't want to make it too easy. That will come back at you in future years. Okay, what are accessibility requirements for visually impaired persons, for example, on public websites of associations? Don, I know you and I have dealt with this quite specifically. My understanding is the specific regulation applies to if there are advertising units for sale or rent on that website. Comments?
Yeah, well, you know what? It's a good idea to make your website handicap accessible anyhow. There's not that much involved. It's, you can easily go out, speak to your website developer. Most of the ones have that little toggle where it can switch and help people who are hearing impaired and vision impaired. But there is one bill now pending. If you have an association operating 150 or more units, you have to have a website in Florida. There is a bill pending by Senator Pizzle that would reduce that to any associations operating websites with 25 or more units. That's going to be huge if it passes. So yeah, you do need to start thinking about this. And there are companies out there. By the way, there's also, I hate to say it, law firms out there that are suing associations for not having handicapped accessible websites and obviously not having handicap accessible common elements. So some thought does need to go into it.
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, it's a very nice thing to do, right? Accessibility to the website. By the way, there's plugins. They're $250 or $500, I think, a year. So the technology is there to now do it quite easily. Okay, James wants to know, not this James, that James, 5-member board. Can board members in non-emergency times meet one-on-one to discuss matters? So not the whole board, just 2 board members. During an open meeting, the board will vote on the motion with no board discussion between board members. All motions are unanimous. I think the implications here is the discussions are going on before the board meeting. So I guess the first part of that question is, you and I are board members, 2 of 5. Donna, can we talk offline, just you and I, about a topic that's going to be on the agenda?
Well, we could, because the law says you need whenever you have a quorum of directors present and discussing association business, that's a de facto board meeting and it needs to be duly noticed and open. But I think from the example being given by James is that while they may be getting around that with just one-on-one conversations, somehow the contents of those conversations are being leaked to the rest of the board before the open board meeting because everybody seems to be on the same page. Look, the bottom line is the Florida legislature and the courts want to make sure that you're operating transparently and openly in front of your members, and that you're not just going to board meetings and rubber stamping things, that the members have a right to be able to hear the deliberative process. Now, whether or not they, listen, every owner thinks if the board only hears what I have to say, it's going to change their mind. My experience has been that's not the case, but people have a right to be able to be part of the deliberative process, just like we're urging people to be part of the process going on in Tallahassee right now. Is it going to make a difference with your legislators and how they vote? Maybe, maybe not, but you should be given the opportunity. So while one-on-one does not violate the law, the letter of the law, it seems to be violating the spirit of the law.
Okay, we're going to be able to deal with one more question. I notice it has to do with priority of liens over mortgage companies. Mariness, put up poll question 5. I've been curious about whether our communities have experienced an increase in their delinquency of their maintenance payments because of COVID. And while they're answering it, what's the priority of a lien that the association would file for a collection matter over the mortgage company, Donna?
Well, that's going to depend entirely, James, on the language in the documents. Some older documents have unfortunate lien subordination language, which actually subordinates the association lien to other lenders' liens and not just institutional first mortgage liens. Now, under the law, hopefully you don't have that, or again, getting back to amendment, this is why it's so important to do a regular audit of your documents to make sure that you don't have anything in there that's actually handicapping the association. But the association's lien is typically going to take priority over every other lien other than a federal tax lien and an institutional first mortgage.
Excellent. Okay, share that result. It looks like we're in pretty good shape here on our finances in our communities. That is a category of questions I want to address at some point, but just one community is having a big problem, a few a little, and for the most part, they're collecting money, which that was a big worry at the beginning of the COVID. Okay.
The only impact we've seen really quick, James, is not a true increase in association delinquencies, but there has been a slowdown because of the federal moratorium on lender foreclosures and evictions.
Right.
So that has actually slowed things down. Associations, we don't want to wind up as we were back in the Great Recession, where associations are waiting years for banks to foreclose. So certainly if there's equity in the unit and for whatever reason you're not being paid, you should foreclose expeditiously. But even then, because of this federal moratorium, speak to counsel. It's much easier to collect small balances than big ones. You may want to still proceed and foreclose subject to the outstanding mortgage and just rent it out in the meantime.
Excellent. Okay, so everyone, thank you. Donna, that was went by in a minute, it seemed to me. I think, Mariness, I'm going to ask you to adjust our survey that we send out to ask our audience if they'd like to do another Q&A like this, rather than, because there's two big topics we have coming down the pike here, Donna. One is the legislative update, and maybe we wait till May after we know which laws passed and which didn't. And we also have amending documents. This is huge. We've been talking about it for a year, but we have a lot of unanswered questions, Donna, and I think we could probably do another open forum because we want to give our customers what they're asking for.
I'd love to answer them. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Donna, thank you so much. We gave you a workout, and I know you adjusted your ankle surgery so you could be here today. So good luck with that. And we want you recovered by next month because we need you here. And to the audience, thanks for sticking with us for a year. You really make it feel good that we're adding value because you keep coming back and asking questions. Our next webinar is going to be April 28th. And we also have one my partner Craig Vaughn does on April 14th. So we're trying to hit them every 2 weeks. April 14th and 28th and are the next ones. Donna and I'll be back April 28th. So Donna, on behalf of you and I and the team here, thank you, everybody, and thanks for leading. Take care.
Thanks, folks.